Chapter 18. Adele's Accusation. "Oh, Mrs. Van Cleve, you've been cheated!" The signing of the papers had taken Penny so by surprise that she did not weigh her words before speaking. Too late she realized that her father never would approve of revealing the facts in such a blunt fashion. However, having said so much, she was determined to go on. "My dear, what do you mean?" inquired Mrs. Van Cleve, troubled by the unexpected accusation. "Any money paid for this land will be lost. My father has just learned—" "I resent such loose talk," Mr. Blake broke in irritably. "Mr. Bowman, whom I represent, has taken a substantial loss on the property." "And who is Ben Bowman?" Penny challenged. "You can't produce him, nor prove he owns the land. The title is faulty. Neither you nor Ben Bowman has any right to sell it." "Is this true?" Mrs. Van Cleve asked the real estate man. "Certainly not. You may be sure that if there is the slightest flaw in the title, I shall return your check." "Perhaps, considering the uncertainty, it might be wise to postpone the payment until I have talked again with Mr. Parker," Mrs. Van Cleve said diffidently. The real estate man made no attempt to hide his annoyance. "My dear Mrs. Van Cleve," he said, "the deal already has been completed. I have tried to remain patient, but really this is too much." On the table lay several typewritten papers. Clipped neatly to the uppermost one was the check endorsed by Mrs. Van Cleve. Mr. Blake reached to take possession of it, but his move was too deliberate. Acting impulsively, Penny darted forward and seized the bit of paper. To the horror of everyone in the tent, she tore the check into a dozen pieces and tossed them into the air. "There!" she announced, a trifle stunned by her own act. "Penelope, you shouldn't have done that," Mrs. Van Cleve reproved. But she smiled faintly. "You are an outrageous child!" Mr. Blake exclaimed, losing his temper. "What do you expect to accomplish with such a stupid trick? Mrs. Van Cleve will merely write out another check." "Well, under the circumstances, it might be better to wait," the clubwoman demurred. "I really shouldn't have acted without consulting Mr. Parker." "Unless the transaction is completed now, I shall have nothing to do with the dedication," Mr. Blake declared. "I shall decline to make my speech." Penny's broad grin made it clear that she thought the loss would not be a great one. "Furthermore, I shall ask that my recent donation be returned," Mr. Blake resumed severely. "I shall withdraw this property for sale." "You will withdraw it?" Penny caught him up. "I thought you were merely acting as the agent for Ben Bowman." I shall make such a suggestion to him," the real estate man amended. Penny waited anxiously for Mrs. Van Cleve's decision. To her relief, the society woman seemed annoyed by the attitude Mr. Blake had taken. "I am sorry," she said coldly. "If you don't wish to make the dedication speech, we will manage to do without your services. As for the check, I cannot make out another until I have discussed the situation with Mr. Parker." The argument went on, but Penny did not remain to hear it. Louise took her forcibly by the arm, fairly pulling her outside the tent. "Haven't you caused enough trouble?" she demanded disapprovingly. "Such a mess as everything is in now." "I don't care," Penny replied. "I saved the camp fund money. Mrs. Van Cleve was glad I tore up the check too. She just didn't dare say so." "There'll be no dedication. What will everyone think?" Disconsolately, Louise gazed toward the area which had been roped off for cars. Although it was half an hour before the formal program was to start, hundreds of persons had arrived. On a platform, built especially for the occasion, an orchestra played sprightly selections. There were picnic tables and a stone fireplace for outdoor cooking. As the girls wandered slowly toward the river, a bus loaded with orphans arrived from the Riverview home. With shrieks of laughter, the children swarmed over the grounds, taking possession of swings, sandpile, and slides. "It seems a pity," Louise remarked again. By 10 o'clock, the grounds were jammed with visitors. Penny knew that her father must have arrived for the exercises, but although she searched everywhere, she could not find him. In roving about, she did meet Mr. Blake, who pretended not to see her. How matters had been arranged, the girls did not know. However, promptly at 10:30, the dedication exercises began exactly as scheduled. Mr. Blake occupied the platform with other members of the board, and at the proper time made a brief and rather curt speech. "Everything seems to have turned out rather well," Louise remarked in relief. "Mr. Blake may not be such a bad sort after all." "Don't you believe it," Penny returned. "He's just clever enough to never put himself in a bad light if he can help it. I only hope Mrs. Van Cleve didn't give in to him and sign over another check." Following the dedication exercises, a portion of the crowd dispersed, but many persons remained to enjoy picnic lunches. Penny and Louise ate their own sandwiches and then watched the orphans at play. "The new camp director seems very efficient," Louise remarked, her gaze upon a young man who supervised the children. Presently, as the girls watched, the camp supervisor announced that he would take several boys and girls for a sail on the river. The boat, a 12-foot dinghy, had been the gift of a well-to-do Riverview department store owner. Immediately there was a great clamor from the children, for everyone wanted to take the first ride. "Only 6 may go," the director said, and called off the names. Penny and Louise wandered down to the water's edge to watch the loading of the boat. Adele had been one of the orphans chosen, and they waved reassuringly to her. The camp director shoved off and quickly raised the sail. There were squeals of delight from the children as it filled, causing the craft to heel over slightly. "The breeze is quite uncertain today," Penny remarked anxiously. "I hope that young man knows what he's about." The boat sailed a diagonal course across the river, turned and came back on another tack. Then, as the breeze died, it seemed to make no progress at all. Losing interest, Penny and Louise started to walk on down the shore. Scarcely had they turned away when they were startled to hear screams from the river. Whirling around, they saw that the camp director was in serious trouble. A sudden puff of wind had caught the boat when it did not have steerage way. Unable to drive ahead, it slowly tilted sideways. "It's going over!" Louise screamed. Already, Penny had kicked off her shoes. Without waiting for the inevitable result, she plunged into the river. With her head emerged from the water, she saw the boat on its side. 2 children were clinging to it. The camp director was frantically trying to support 2 others, while another girl and boy struggled wildly to keep from sinking. Swimming as rapidly as she could, Penny reached the overturned boat. Her first act was to help the camp director, who was being strangled by the 2 children who clung to him. Drawing the trio to the craft, she then seized a struggling boy by the hair and pulled him to safety. "Adele!" the camp director gasped. "Get her!" The little girl had been carried a considerable distance from the boat. Penny started to swim toward her, but she saw that it would not be necessary. From the forest close by had emerged an unshaven man in rough, soiled clothing. Diving into the water, he seized Adele and swam with her to shore. Penny did not return to the overturned boat, for several men had waded out to tow it to land. Concerned regarding Adele, she followed the child's rescuer. The man bore the orphan in his arms to a grassy spot on shore. Stretching her out there, he hesitated an instant, and then, before the crowd could surround him, darted quickly away to the woods. "Wait!" Penny shouted, wading through the shallow water. The man heard but paid no heed. He entered the forest and was lost to view. "That was Clem Davis," Penny thought tensely. "I'm sure of it." Before she could reach Adele, other persons had gathered around the child. Clyde Blake pushed through the crowd. "What is this?" he inquired. "What has happened?" As the man bent over Adele, the little girl opened her eyes, gazing directly into his face. For a moment, she stared at him in a bewildered way. Then, struggling to a sitting position, she pointed an accusing finger. "You are the one!" she whispered shakily. "You're the man whose car killed my mother and daddy!" End of chapter 18. Chapter 19. Trailing a Fugitive. Adele's accusation brought a murmur of consternation and shocked surprise from the crowd. Mr. Blake, however, seemed undisturbed. Dropping on his knees, he supported Adele and wrapped his coat around her trembling shoulders. "There, my poor child," he said soothingly. "You are quite upset, and for good reason."
"Don't touch me!"
Adele shivered, cringing away.
"You're mean and cruel."
By this time, Miss Anderson and other officials of the Riverview home had reached the scene. Somewhat sternly, they tried to silence the child. "She doesn't know what she's saying," Miss Anderson apologized to Mr. Blake. "Adele has been very nervous since she was in an automobile accident." "I quite understand," the real estate man responded. "The child must have a change of clothing and no doubt medical care. May I send her to the home in my car?" "Why, that is very kind of you, I'm sure," Miss Anderson said gratefully. With every appearance of concern, Mr. Blake picked Adele up in his arms and carried her away. Penny was kept busy helping bundle up the other children who had been rescued from the water. None the worse for misadventure, they too were taken to Mr. Blake's car. "Here, put on my coat before you freeze," Louise said anxiously to Penny after the automobile had sped away. "We must start home at once."
"I don't want to go now," Penny protested. "Did you notice that man who pulled Adele from the water?"
"He looked like a tramp. Wonder what made him run away."
"Lou, I think that man was Clem Davis. By rights I should tell the sheriff, but I can't bring myself to do it. Not after the way he saved Adele."
"Never mind all that now," Louise said, forcing Penny toward the car. "You must go home and change your wet clothes."
"But I want to find Clem Davis and talk with him."
"That will have to wait. You're going home." Taking her chum firmly by the arm, Louise pushed her into the car. At the Parker home, Penny changed her clothes, discussing the day's events as she dried her hair. Adele's accusation had not escaped her, and she had taken it more seriously than did others in the crowd.
"Perhaps that child knew what she was talking about," she declared to Louise. "Blake's car may have been the one which killed her parents."
"Oh, Penny, you're so hopelessly prejudiced against that man," her chum replied.
"Oh, maybe I am, but Adele is the only person who can identify the hit-run motorist."
"Even so, you know she probably is not a reliable witness."
"I'll grant that her accident today may have upset her emotionally," Penny conceded. "After she recovers, I'm curious to learn what she'll have to say."
The hour was so late that the girls did not return to the campsite. Louise soon went to her own home and Penny was left alone. She restlessly wandered about, polished the car, and fretted because neither her father nor Mrs. Weems came home. At length, for want of another occupation, she motored to the Riverview home on the pretext of inquiring about the condition of the children rescued from the water.
"They're doing just fine," Miss Anderson assured her. "That is, all except Adele. The child is very upset." "Has she said anything more about Mr. Blake?" Penny inquired.
"She doesn't know his name, but she keeps insisting he was the man whose car killed her parents. I never was so mortified in my life as when she made that accusation. Fortunately, Mr. Blake did not take offense." Penny was eager to talk with Adele, and Miss Anderson said that she might do so for a few minutes. The little girl had been put to bed, but seemed quite content as she played with a new doll. "Mr. McGuire sent me this," she said, holding it up for Penny to see. "I've named her Imogene." Miss Anderson was called to the telephone. During the young woman's absence, Penny discreetly questioned Adele about the motor accident in which her parents had lost their lives. She was worried lest the child be upset again, but to her relief, Adele answered in a matter-of-fact tone. "No one will believe me," the little girl said. "Just the same, that man I saw today was the one who ran into my daddy's car. He had a big gray automobile with a horn on it that played a tune." "A gray car?" Penny repeated thoughtfully. "I'm quite sure Mr. Blake's sedan is dark blue. Why, you were taken home in his automobile this afternoon, Adele." "It wasn't that car," the child answered. He must have another one. Miss Anderson re-entered the room, so Penny did not ask additional questions. Soon leaving the home, she motored slowly toward the campsite by the river. Although she readily understood that Adele might be mistaken, a conviction was growing upon her that Clyde Blake could have been the hit-and-run driver. Even if he doesn't drive a gray car, that proves nothing, she mused. He easily could have changed it during the last year. Penny thought that she might find her father or some of the camp board officials still at the river. However, as she drove into the parking area, she observed that the grounds were entirely deserted. Paper plates, napkins, and newspapers had been blown helter-skelter by the wind. Picnic tables still held the unsightly remains of lunches. The speaker's platform had been torn down. Even the tents were gone, for it was not planned to make practical use of the grounds until more work had been done. As Penny was starting to drive away, she noticed a lone man near one of the picnic tables. He was dressed in rough, unpressed garments and seemed to be scavenging food which had been left behind. "That's the same man who pulled Adele from the water," she thought alertly. Leaping from the car, Penny ran toward him. Hearing footsteps, the man turned and saw her. Almost in panic, he started for the woods. "Wait!" Penny shouted. "I won't turn you over to the police. Please wait!" The man hesitated, then, apparently deciding that he had nothing to fear from a girl, paused. "I want to thank you for saving Adele," Penny said breathlessly. "Why did you run away?"
"Well, I don't know," the man answered, avoiding her gaze. I never liked crowds."
Penny decided to risk a direct accusation. "You are Clem Davis," she said, eyeing him steadily.
"That's a laugh," the man retorted, starting to edge away. "My name is Thomas Ryan."
"Now please don't run away again," Penny pleaded, sensing his intention. "If you are Clem Davis, and I'm sure you are, I want to help you."
"How could you help me?"
"By exposing the men who framed you. I never believed that you set fire to the Preston barn."
"I never did."
"Please tell me about it," Penny urged, seating herself at one of the picnic benches.
"Who are you anyway?" the man asked suspiciously. "Why are you so willing to help me, as you say?"
"I'm Penelope Parker, and my father publishes the Star."
"Oh, I see you're after a story."
"No, that part is only incidental," Penny said hurriedly. "What my father really wants to do is to expose the Black Hoods and drive them out of existence. You're the one person who might be able to provide evidence which would convict the guilty parties."
"I could tell plenty if I was a mind to do it. No one would believe me though."
"I will, Mr. Davis."
"I was in the notion of going to the grand jury at one time," the man said slowly. "That's what brought on all my trouble. If I'd had sense enough to have kept my mouth shut, I wouldn't be a fugitive now."
"What connection do you have with the Hoods? Were you a member of the organization?"
"Yes, I was," the man admitted reluctantly. "I didn't know much about the Hoods when I joined them. Then I tried to drop out, and that's what turned them against me."
"Suppose you tell me all about it. What is the real purpose of the organization?"
"Well, right now, the Hoods are trying to force every truck driver in this district to join the county cooperative."
"Then Hank Holloway must be the ringleader!" Penny exclaimed, startled by the information.
"No, he's not at the head of the Hoods," Clem Davis corrected.
"Who is the man?" Penny questioned eagerly. Clem Davis started to speak, then hesitated. An automobile had driven into the parking lot only a few rods away. Several workmen who had been assigned to clean up the grounds alighted.
"They're coming this way,"
Clem Davis said uneasily.
"I can't risk being seen."
Abruptly, he started toward the sheltering trees. "Wait!" Penny pleaded, pursuing him. "You haven't told me half enough. Please wait!"
"I'm not going to risk arrest," the man returned over his shoulder.
"At least meet me here again."
"Okay, I'll do that,"
Clem Davis agreed. "Tomorrow night, just at dusk," Penny said quickly. "And please don't fail me. I promise I'll help you." End of chapter 19. Chapter 20. Clem Davis's Disclosure. After Clem Davis had disappeared into the woods, Penny wasted no more time in the vicinity. Jumping into her car, she drove home in a daze of excitement to tell her father the amazing story. "Meeting that man was wonderful luck," she assured him exultantly. "Why, if only he reveals what he knows, we will get an exclusive story for the Star and will expose the Hoods and put an end to the organization." "As easy as that," laughed Mr. Parker. "Seriously though, I think we are on the verge of cracking the story. In going over the books of the county cooperative, Jerry has discovered any number of discrepancies." "I've always thought that Hank Holloway might be connected with the Hoods, Dad. I believe he was the night rider who made off with Mrs. Davis' melons." "Any idea who the other members of the outfit might be?" "Not yet, but I expect to find out when I meet Clem Davis tomorrow." "I'll go with you," Mr. Parker declared. "Maybe I should take Sheriff Daniels along too." "Oh, Dad!" Penny protested indignantly. "I promised to help Clem, not turn him over to an officer. I'm afraid that unless I go alone, he'll not even show himself." "Perhaps it would be best for you to go by yourself," the editor admitted. "Learn what you can from Davis and make an appointment for him to see me." Another matter weighed heavily on Penny's mind. In her encounter with Clyde Blake that morning, she had acted in a high-handed manner, and sooner or later her father must hear about the check episode. "Dad, I have a confession to make," she began awkwardly. "When I reached the camp this morning, I found that Mr. Blake had induced the board members to buy the property." "Never mind," Mr. Parker interrupted. "I've already heard the details of your disgraceful actions from Mrs. Van Cleve." "I am thoroughly ashamed of myself," Penny said contritely. "I tore up the check on the spur of the moment." "It was a foolish, rather dramatic thing to do. However, I must acknowledge that the result was highly pleasing to everyone save Clyde Blake." "What does he have to say, Dad?" "He claims that he acted in good faith for Benjamin Bowman. Likewise, that he had no suspicion the title was faulty." "Naturally, he would take such an attitude." "I've asked Blake to produce Ben Bowman," Mr. Parker resumed. "Unless he can do so and prove that the property actually is owned by him, the deal is off." "Do you think Blake will bring the man to Riverview?" "I doubt it very much," the editor answered. "I suspect he'll bluff and finally let the deal go through by default. It will be an easy way out for him." "Blake always seems to escape his misdeeds. I wish we could find Ben Bowman ourselves and bring the two men together. That would be interesting." "Finding Ben Bowman would serve many useful purposes," Mr. Parker said grimly. "But now that I would actually welcome a communication from him, he no longer pesters me." Eagerly, Penny awaited the hour appointed for her meeting with Clem Davis. Knowing that the man did not obtain enough to eat, she spent considerable time the next afternoon preparing a lunch basket of substantial food. Taking it with her, she waited at the campsite for nearly half an hour. Finally, just as she began to think that the man had failed her, he appeared. "I've brought you some hot coffee," Penny said, taking the plug from a thermos bottle. "A little food, too."
"Say, that's swell," the man murmured gratefully. "My wife slips me a handout whenever she can, but lately the house has been watched so closely she can't get away."
Seating himself at the picnic table, Clem Davis drained the cup of coffee in a few swallows and greedily devoured the sandwich.
"Now, what do you want to know?"
he asked gruffly. Mr. Parker had told Penny exactly what questions to ask. She began with the most important one. "Mr. Davis, tell me, who is the head man of the Hoods?"
"I don't know myself," he answered promptly. "At the meetings, the master always wore a robe and a black hood. None of the members ever were permitted to see his face."
"You have no idea who the man may be?" Clem Davis shook his head as he bit into another sandwich.
"I doubt there are more than one or two members of the order who know his identity. Hank Holloway might, or maybe Charlie Phelps."
"Is Phelps a member?" Penny asked quickly.
"One of the chief ones. Most of the meetings are held at his place."
"You don't mean at the Hubell Tower?" Penny's pulse had stepped up to a faster pace, for the information was of the greatest value. Furthermore, it thrilled her that her own theory regarding Charlie Phelps was receiving support.
"Sure, the Hoods meet at the tower about once a month. Clem Davis disclosed. Usually they get together on the 13th, but sometimes they have extra sessions. When special meetings are held, a green light burns on the tower, or the clock strikes 13 times just at midnight.
I thought so, Penny exclaimed, highly elated. Tell me, why did you decide to break your connection with the Hoods?
I joined the organization before I knew what I was letting myself in for. When they made plans to burn the Preston barn, I wanted to quit. The Hoods threatened me, and to get even, planted evidence that made it look as if I had set the fire.
Penny was inclined to believe that Clem Davis had told a straight story, for it coincided with her own theories. Always it had seemed to her that the evidence pointing to his guilt had been entirely too plain. To corroborate her conclusion, she had brought from home the watch fob found at the Davis stable, hoping that he might identify it.
"That's not mine," he said promptly when she showed the article to him. "I never saw it before."
Penny opened the tiny case, displaying the child's picture. However, the man had no idea who the little boy might be. "Mr. Davis," she said quietly, replacing the watch fob in her pocket, "I believe in your innocence and I want to help you. I'm sure I can, providing you're willing to cooperate."
"I already told you about everything I know."
"You've given me splendid information," Penny praised. "What I want you to do is talk with my father. He'll probably ask you to repeat your story to the grand jury."
"I'd be a fool to do that," Clem Davis responded. "I can't prove any of my statements. The Preston fire would be pinned on me, and the Hoods might try to harm my wife. Why, they ran off with a truckload of our melons the other night."
"I know, but unless someone has the courage to speak out against the Hoods, they'll become bolder and do even more harm. Supposing you were promised absolute protection, then would you go before the grand jury?"
"Nothing would give me more pleasure. But who can guarantee I'll not be made to pay?"
"I think my father can," Penny assured him. "Will you meet him here tomorrow night at this same hour?"
"Okay," the man agreed, getting up from the table. "You seem to be on the level."
"I'll bring more food tomorrow," Penny said as an extra inducement. "You must have a hard time since you've been hiding out in the woods."
"Oh, it's not so bad once you get used to it," the man shrugged. "I got a pretty good place to sleep now."
"Inside a building?" Penny asked curiously.
"An automobile," the man grinned. "Someone abandoned it in the swamp and I've taken possession."
"An old one, I suppose."
"Not so old," Clem Davis answered. "Funny thing, it's a 1941 deluxe model with good upholstery. Only thing I can see wrong with it is the front grille and fenders have been smashed."
"The car isn't by any chance a gray one?"
"Why, yes it is," the man admitted. "How'd you guess?"
"I didn't guess," Penny returned soberly. "I have a suspicion that car is the one which killed 2 people about a year ago. Mr. Davis, you must take me to it at once." End of chapter 20. Chapter 21. A Broken Promise.
"You want me to take you to the abandoned car now?" Clem Davis echoed in surprise. "It's located deep in the swamp, just off a side road."
"Would it require long to get there?" Penny asked thoughtfully.
"A half hour at least. With night coming on, you wouldn't be able to see a thing."
"It is getting dark," Penny admitted regretfully. "Everything considered, I guess it would be better to wait until tomorrow. But in the meantime, I wish you would search the car carefully. Get the engine number, anything which might help to identify the owner."
"Engine number's been filed off," Clem answered. "I'll give the car a good going over though to see what I can learn. Oh, and thanks for the food."
Raising his hand in a semi-salute, the man started into the woods. "Don't forget to meet Dad and me tomorrow night," Penny called after him. "We'll be waiting here about the same time." The interview with the fugitive had more than fulfilled Penny's expectations. Driving straight home, she made a full report of the talk to her father. Breathlessly, she revealed that the Hoods held monthly meetings at the Hubell Tower and that both Hank Holloway and Charley Phelps were members of the order.
You weren't able to learn the name of the head man? Mr. Parker questioned.
"No, but Clem didn't know it himself. He says the master never shows himself to anyone, but always appears in a mask."
Mr. Parker began to pace the floor, a habit of his when under mental stress. The information Penny had acquired was of utmost importance. He believed it to be authentic, but he dared not overlook the possibility that Clem Davis had deliberately lied. "We must move cautiously on this story," he said aloud. "Should we make false accusations against innocent persons, the Star could face disastrous lawsuits."
"You're not going to withhold the information from the public?"
Penny demanded in disappointment. "For the present, I must. The thing for us to do is to try to learn the identity of the head man. Any news published in the Star would only serve as a tip-off to him."
"You're right, of course," Penny agreed after a moment of silence.
"Now that we have made such a splendid start, it should be easy to gain additional information," the editor resumed. "You say the meetings usually are held on the 13th of the month."
"That's what Clem Davis told me."
"Then we'll arrange to have the tower watched on that night. In the meantime, I'll see Davis and learn what I can from him. Jerry is working on the county cooperative angle of the story and should have some interesting facts soon." Penny knew that her father was adopting a wise policy, but she could not help feeling slightly disappointed. Always eager for action, she had hoped that Clem Davis' disclosures would lead to the immediate arrest of both Hank Holloway and Charley Phelps. However, she brightened at the thought that at least additional revelations might follow her father's meeting with the fugitive. The following night, shortly after 6:30, Penny and Mr. Parker presented themselves at the orphans' campsite. They had brought a basket of food, coffee, and a generous supply of cigarettes. "What time did Davis promise to meet you?" Mr. Parker asked impatiently.
"He should be here now," Penny returned. "I can't imagine why he's late."
Another half hour elapsed and still the fugitive did not appear. Mr. Parker paced restlessly beside the picnic table, becoming increasingly impatient.
"He's probably waiting until after dark,"
Penny declared optimistically. Another hour elapsed. The shadows deepened and a chill wind blew from the river. Hungry mosquitoes kept Mr. Parker more than occupied as he sought to protect himself. "Well, I've had enough of this," he announced at last. "The man is not coming."
"Oh, Dad, let's wait just a little longer," Penny coaxed. "I'm sure he meant to keep his promise."
"Perhaps he did, although I'm inclined to think otherwise. At any rate, I am going home." Penny had no choice but to follow her father to the car. She could not understand Clem Davis' failure to appear unless he had feared that he might be placed under arrest. While it was possible that the man might come to the picnic grounds the following night, she was afraid she would never see him again. "I half expected this to happen," Mr. Parker remarked as he drove toward Riverview. "Unless we can get Davis to swear to his story, we haven't a scrap of real evidence against the Hoods."
"We may learn something on the night of the 13th,
Penny said hopefully. "Possibly. But I'm beginning to wonder if everything Davis told you may not have been for the purpose of deception."
"He seems sincere. I can't believe he deliberately lied to me."
Submerged in gloom, Penny had little to say during the swift ride into Riverview. She could not blame her father for feeling annoyed because the trip had cost him 2 hours of valuable time. Clem Davis' failure to appear undoubtedly might deprive the Star of a spectacular scoop. "Never mind," Mr. Parker said to comfort her. "It wasn't your fault. We'll find another way to get our information." The car proceeded slowly through the downtown section of Riverview. Turning her head to read an electric sign, Penny's attention was drawn to a man in a gray suit who was walking close to the curb.
"Dad, stop the car!" she cried, seizing his arm. "There he is now!"
"Clem Davis?" Mr. Parker demanded, swerving the automobile toward a vacant space near the sidewalk.
No, Ben Bowman! I'm sure it is he!"
Springing from the car, Penny glanced up the street. She had alighted just in time to see the man in gray enter a telegraph office. "What nonsense is this?" Mr. Parker inquired impatiently. "Why do you think the fellow is Ben Bowman?"
"I'm sure he's the same man I saw at Claymore. The one who tried to pass a forged check." Oh, please, Dad, we can't let him get away.
Switching off the car ignition, Mr. Parker stepped to the curb. "If it should prove to be Ben Bowman, nothing would please me better than to nab him," he announced grimly. "But if you've made a mistake—"
Come on, Penny urged, seizing his hand. We can talk about it later.
Through the huge plate glass of the telegraph office, the man in gray could be seen standing at one of the counters. His back was to the street and he appeared to be writing a message.
I'm sure it's Ben Bowman, Penny said again. Why not go inside and ask him if that's his name?
"I shall. But I'm warning you again, if you've made one of your little mistakes—"
Go ahead, faint heart, Penny chuckled, giving him a tiny push. I'll stay here by the door, ready to stop him if he gets by you.
With no appearance of haste, Mr. Parker sauntered into the telegraph office. Deliberately taking a place at the counter close beside the man in gray, he pretended to write a message. Actually, he studied his companion and attempted to read the lengthy telegram which the other had composed. Before he could do so, the man handed the paper to a girl clerk.
"Get this off right away. Send it collect."
The clerk examined the message, having difficulty in reading the writing.
This night letter is to be sent to Anthony Parker? She inquired.
"That's right,"
the man agreed. Mr. Parker waited for no more. Touching the man on the arm, he said distinctly: "I'll save you the trouble of sending that message. I am Anthony Parker." The man whirled around, his face plainly showing consternation. "You're Ben Bowman, I assume?" Mr. Parker said coolly. "I've long looked forward to meeting you."
"You've got me mixed up with someone else," the man mumbled, edging away. "My name's Clark Edgewater. See, I signed it to this telegram."
As proof of his contention, he pointed to the lengthy communication which lay on the counter. One glance satisfied Mr. Parker that it was another crank message. "I don't care how you sign your name," he retorted. "You are Ben Bowman. We have a few matters to talk over." The man gazed uncertainly at Mr. Parker. He started to speak, then changed his mind. Turning, he made a sudden break for the exit. "Stop him!" Mr. Parker shouted. "Don't let him get away!" Penny stood close to the door. As the man rushed toward her, she shot the bolt into place. "Not quite so fast, Mr. Bowman," she said, smiling. "We really must have a chat with you." End of Chapter 21. Chapter 22. The Man in Gray. With the door locked, the man saw that he could not hope to escape. Accepting the situation, he regarded Mr. Parker and Penny with cold disdain. "All right, my name is Ben Bowman," he acknowledged, shrugging. "So what?" "You're the man who's been sending me collect messages for the past 3 months," Mr. Parker accused. "And what if I have? Is there any law against it? You run a lousy paper, and as a reader, I have a right to complain. But not at my expense. Another thing, I want to know what connection you've had with Clyde Blake." "Never heard of him." "Then you don't own property in this city?" "Nor anywhere else. Now, if you're through giving me the 3rd degree, I'll move on." "Not so fast," interposed Penny, refusing to unbar the door. "If I'm not mistaken, you're the same man who is wanted at Claymore for forging a check." "Really, this is too much!" Ben Bowman exclaimed angrily. "Unless you can permit me to pass, I shall protest to the police." "I see an officer just across the street," Mr. Parker declared. "Penny, will you call him over?" "Just a minute," Ben Bowman interposed in an altered tone. "We can settle this ourselves. I'll admit I was hasty in sending those messages. Just a way to let off steam, I guess. If you're willing to forget about it, I'll repay you for every dollar you spent." "I'm afraid I can't forget that easily," Mr. Parker retorted. "No, unless you're willing to come clean about your connection with Clyde Blake, I'll have to call the police." "What do you want to know about him?" "Is he acting as your real estate agent?"
Certainly not.
Do you know the man?
I've done a little work for him.
Didn't he pay you to allow him to use your name on a deed?
He gave me $25 to make out some papers for him. I only copied what he told me to write.
That's all I want to know, Mr. Parker said grimly. Penny, call the policeman.
See here,
Ben Bowman protested furiously.
you intimated that if I told you what I knew about Blake, you'd let me off. Why, you're as yellow as that paper you run.
I make no deals with men of your stamp, Mr. Parker retorted. As Penny unlocked the door, Ben Bowman made a break for freedom. However, the editor was entirely prepared. Seizing the man, he held him until Penny could summon the policeman. Still struggling, Bowman was loaded into a patrol car and taken to police headquarters. "I guess that earns me a nice little $100, Penny remarked as she and her father went to their own car. "Thanks, Dad." "You're entirely welcome," Mr. Parker grinned. "I never took greater pleasure in acknowledging a debt." "What's your next move, Dad? Will you expose Clyde Blake in tomorrow's Star?" "I'm tempted to do it, Penny. The evidence is still rather flimsy, but even if Ben Bowman denies his story, I think we can prove our charges." "It's a pity you can't break the Hood yarn in the same edition," Penny said musingly. "What a front page that would make!" "It certainly would be a good 3 pennies worth," Mr. Parker agreed. "Unfortunately, it will be many days before the Hoods are supposed to hold their meeting in the tower." "But why wait? We could call that gathering ourselves." "Just how?" "Simple as pie. All we would need to do would be to have the clock strike 13 instead of 12. Penny glanced at her wristwatch and added persuasively, "We have several hours in which to work." "You're completely crazy," accused Mr. Parker. "Just how would you arrange to have the clock strike 13? "I'll take care of that part, Dad. All I'll need is a hammer." "To use on the caretaker, Charley Phelps, I suppose," Mr. Parker remarked ironically. "Oh, no," Penny corrected. "I propose to turn all the strong arm work over to you and your gang of reporters. Naturally, Phelps will have to be removed from the scene." "What you propose is absolutely impossible," the editor declared. "Even so, I'll admit that I find your idea rather fascinating." "This is no time for being conservative, Dad. Why, the Hoods must know you are out to break up their organization. Every day you wait lessens your chance of getting the story." "I realize that only too well, Penny. I pinned quite a bit of hope on Clem Davis. His failure to appear puts everything in a different light." "Why not test what he told us?" Penny argued. "It will be easy to learn if the striking of the clock is a signal to call the Hood meeting. If the men should come, we'll have them arrested and run a big story tomorrow morning." "Coming from your lips, it sounds so very simple," Mr. Parker smiled. "Has it occurred to you that if we fail, we'll probably breakfast at the police station?" "Why worry about that?" grinned Penny. "You have influence." Mr. Parker sat for several minutes, lost in thought. "You know, I've always been lucky," Penny coaxed. "I feel a double dose of it coming on tonight." "I believe in hunches myself," Mr. Parker chuckled. "No doubt I'm making the biggest mistake of my life, but I'm going to try your wild scheme. Crazy as it is, it may work." "Then let's go!" Penny laughed. At the Star office, Mr. Parker hastily summoned a special staff of newspapermen, warning them to hold themselves in readiness to get out a special edition on short notice. From the group, he chose Salt Sommers, Jerry Livingston, and 2 reporters known for their pugilistic prowess. "Now, this is the lineup, boys," he revealed. "We're going to kidnap Charley Phelps from the tower. It's risky business unless things break right for us, so if any of you want to drop out now, this is your chance." "We're with you, Chief," declared Salt Sommers, tossing a pack of photographic supplies over his shoulder. "Sure, what are we waiting for?" chimed in Jerry. It was well after 11 o'clock. by the time the overloaded press car drew up not far from the Hubble Tower. Penny parked on a dark side street and Jerry was sent to look over the situation. Soon he returned with his report.
"Charlie Phelps is alone in the tower," he assured the editor. "We shouldn't have any trouble handling him."
"Okay, then let's do the job," Mr. Parker returned. "Remember, if we muff it, we'll do our explaining to a judge." Separating into groups so they would not attract attention, Penny and the 5 men approached the tower. A light glowed from within, and the caretaker could be seen moving about in the tiny living room. Tying handkerchiefs over their faces, Salt and Jerry rapped on the back door. Charlie Phelps opened it to find himself gazing into the blinding light of 2 flashlights. "Say what?" he began, but did not finish. Jerry and Salt had seized his arms. Before he could make another sound, they shoved a gag into his mouth and, dragging him into the tower, closed the door. Working swiftly, they trussed his hands and feet and pushed him into a machinery room. "Nice work, boys," Mr. Parker praised. "Listen!" whispered Penny, who had followed the men into the tower. The clock had begun to strike the hour of midnight. "Get up there quickly and do your stuff," her father commanded. "You've not much time." 2 steps at a time, Penny raced up the steep iron stairway which led to the belfry of the tower. Anxiously, she counted the strokes as they pealed forth, loud and clear. 7, 8, 9. The clock had never seemed to strike so fast before. Desperately, she wondered if she could reach the belfry in time. The stairway was dark, the footing uncertain. In her nervousness, Penny stumbled. Clutching the handrail, she clung to it a moment until she recovered her balance. But in that interval, the clock had kept striking and she was no longer sure of the count. "It must be 11," she thought, running up the remaining steps. "The next stroke will be the last." Penny reached the great bell just as the clapper struck against the metal. The sound was deafening. "Now!" she thought excitedly. "This is the moment and I dare not fail." Balancing herself precariously, Penny raised a hammer high above her head. With all her strength, she brought it down hard against the bell. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23. A Trap Set. To Penny's sensitive ears, the sound which resulted from the hammer blow seemed weak and lacking in resonance. She sagged back against the iron railing, feeling that she had failed. "That was swell," a low voice said in her ear. "A perfect 13th stroke." Turning around, Penny saw that Jerry Livingston had followed her into the belfry. "Did it really sound all right?" she inquired anxiously. "It was good enough to fool anyone. But the question is, will it bring the Hoods here?" In the room far below, Mr. Parker had lowered the blinds of the circular windows. Making certain that Charlie Phelps was securely bound and gagged so that he could make no sound, he opened the front door a tiny crack and left it that way. "How about the lights?" Salt Sommers asked. "Leave them on. Shove that sound apparatus under the daybed. Now, I guess everything's set. Upstairs, everyone." Mr. Parker, Salt, and the 2 reporters joined Penny and Jerry on the iron stairway. "We may have a long vigil," the editor warned. "In fact, this whole scheme is likely to turn out a bust." Few words were spoken during the next 20 minutes. Penny stirred restlessly and finally went to join Jerry, who was maintaining a watch from the belfry. "See anyone?" she whispered, scanning the street below. "No sign of anyone yet." At intervals, automobiles whizzed past the tower, and presently one drew up not far from the building. Immediately, Jerry and Penny focused their attention upon it. The headlights were turned to parking, then a man alighted and came toward the Hubble Tower. "Who's he?" Jerry whispered. "Can you tell?" "I'm not sure," Penny said uncertainly. "It may be Hank Holloway." As the man stepped into the light, they both saw that her identification had been correct. The man rapped on the door several times. Receiving no answer, he finally entered. "Charlie?" Those on the iron stairway heard him call. "Where are you?" The brilliantly lighted living room combined with the absence of the caretaker seemed to mystify the newcomer. Muttering to himself, he moved restlessly about for a few minutes. Finally seating himself, he picked up a newspaper and began to read. From their post in the belfry, Penny and Jerry soon observed two other men approaching the tower. One they recognized as a workman who had sorted melons at the Davis farm, but his companion was unknown to them. Without rapping, they too entered the building.
"Where's Charlie?"
inquired one of the men. "That's what I was wondering," Hank Holloway replied, tossing aside his paper. "For that matter, I can't figure out why this special meeting was called. Something important must have come up." Within 10 minutes, 3 other men had arrived. Jerry was able to identify 2 of them by name, but he dared not risk whispering the information to Mr. Parker, who crouched on the stairway. "There's something mighty queer about this meeting," Hank Holloway growled. "Where is the master? And what's become of Charlie?" From the machinery room in which the caretaker had been imprisoned came a slight thumping sound. "What was that?" Hank demanded suspiciously.
"I didn't hear anything,"
answered one of the other men.
"Maybe it was someone at the door."
Hank tramped across the room to peer out into the night. As the door swung back, a dark figure moved swiftly along the hedge, crouching low.
"Who's there?"
Hank asked sharply.
"Quiet, you fool,"
was the harsh response. A man wearing a dark robe and a black hood which completely hid his face, brushed past Holloway and entered the tower living room.
"Close the door," he ordered.
Holloway hastened to obey. An expectant and rather tense silence had fallen upon the men gathered in the room.
"Now what is the meaning of this?"
the master demanded, facing the group.
"Who called this meeting?" "Why, didn't you?"
Holloway asked blankly.
"I did not." "All I know is that I heard the clock strike an extra stroke," Holloway explained. "I thought it was queer to be having another meeting so soon. Then I found Charlie wasn't here." "Charlie not here?"
the master exclaimed.
"Oh, he must have stepped out somewhere. The lights were on and the door partly open." "I don't like this," the master said, his voice sharp. "Charlie has no right to call a meeting without a special order from me. It is becoming increasingly dangerous for us to gather here."
"Now you're talking," Holloway nodded.
"Anthony Parker of the Star is on the warpath again. One of his reporters has been prying into the books of the county cooperative." "He'll learn nothing from that source, I trust."
"Not enough to do any harm."
"You act as though you had a grievance, Holloway. Any complaints?"
"I know the cooperative has made a lot of money since you've taken over. We want to go along with you, if your flair for the dramatic doesn't get us in too deep."
"What do you mean by that, Holloway?"
"This night riding business is getting risky. Why, if Clem Davis should talk."
"We're not through with him yet."
"Another thing, most of us never did approve of holding public meetings here at the tower," Hank Holloway went on. "It's too public a place, and sooner or later someone will start asking questions about what goes on."
"Anything else?"
"Well, we think you ought to show yourself. Let us know who you are. We're all in this together and we ought to take the same risks. I've been carrying the heavy end."
"That settles it,"
the masked man said with finality.
"We're through."
"How do you mean?" Holloway asked.
"We're breaking up the organization. Now. Tonight."
"There's no call to do that."
"Holloway, you do a lot of talking and not much thinking,"
the other snapped.
"This will be our last meeting. We'll divide the profits and for a time at least remain inactive."
"That's all very well for you," Holloway complained. "You step out of it without anyone even knowing who you are. But some of us are tied up with the county cooperative. If there's any investigation, we'll take the rap."
There'll be no investigation."
"That's easy to say," Holloway argued. "I don't like the way things have been going lately. If we're breaking up, we have a right to know who you are." "Sure," chimed in another. "Remove your mask and let's have a look. We think we have your number, but we ain't positive."
"You never will be," the masked man returned coolly, backing toward the door. "And now, good night."
"Oh, no, you don't!" Holloway cried, trying to head him off.
"Stand back,"
ordered the master harshly. From beneath his robe he whipped out a revolver.
"All right," Holloway sneered. "I never argue when I'm looking into a muzzle."
Before the master could retreat, there was another disturbance from inside the machinery room. Unmistakably, the door rattled.
"Someone is in there!"
Holloway exclaimed. Startled, the master postponed his flight. Still holding the revolver, he tried to open the door but found it locked. For those hiding on the stairway, the situation had become a tense one. In another moment, the members of the Black Hoods unquestionably would break the lock and find Charley Phelps.
"Let's take 'em, Chief," whispered Jerry, who was eager for action. "Now's our only chance." All set. Mr. Parker gave the signal.
With a concerted rush, the four young men leaped down the stairway, hurling themselves on Holloway and the masked man. Catching the latter unaware, Jerry knocked the revolver from his hand and it went spinning across the floor. Penny started down the stairway, but Mr. Parker pushed her back. "Stay where you are," he ordered as he too joined the fray. Penny huddled against the wall, watching fearfully. Her father and the reporters outnumbered their opponents by one man, but the Hoods were all strong, powerful fellows who fought desperately. A chair crashed against the lamp, shattering it. In the resulting darkness, she could no longer see what was happening. Suddenly, a figure broke away from the general tangle of bodies and darted towards the circular stairway. For a moment Penny believed that he must be one of the reporters. Then she saw the man wore a hood over his face.
"The master!" she thought, chills racing up her spine. "He's trying to get away, and I've got to stop him!"
End of chapter 23. Chapter 24. Timely Help. As the black-robed man started up the stairway, Penny attempted to block his path. Failing to trip him, she seized his arms and held fast.
"Out of my way!"
the man cried, giving her a hard push. Penny clung tightly and struggled to reach the hood which covered his face. Suddenly, the man jerked free and darted up the steep circular stairway. Pursuing him, Penny was able to seize the long flowing black robe, only to have it tear loose in her hands. Gaining the first landing, midway to the belfry, the man did not hesitate. Swinging his legs through an open window, he leaped to the ground 20 feet below.
"He'll be killed!"
Penny thought. Reaching the window, she saw the man lying in a heap at the base of the tower. For a moment, he remained motionless. But as she watched, he slowly scrambled to his feet and staggered off. Until the man ducked behind the high hedge, Penny saw him plainly silhouetted in the moonlight. Although his black hood remained in place, his body no longer was covered by the dark robe.
"I know him," she thought. "Even with his mask on, I'm sure I can't be wrong."
Fearing to attempt the hazardous leap, Penny ran down the iron stairway, shouting that the master of the Hoods had escaped. By this time, Mr. Parker's crew of reporters had gained the upper hand of the remaining members of the organization. "Which way did the fellow go?" the editor demanded, running to the door.
"Along the hedge, toward the street," Penny directed.
Leaving Jerry Salt and the others to guard the prisoners, Mr. Parker and his daughter hastened outdoors. There was no sign of anyone in the vicinity of the tower.
"He can't be far away," Penny maintained. "Anyway, I know his identity."
"You saw his face?"
"No, but as he ran across the yard, I noticed that one arm was much shorter than the other."
"Clyde Blake."
"That's what I think. Maybe we can catch him at his home."
"If Blake is our man, we'll get him," Mr. Parker said tersely. "We may need help, though." Re-entering the tower building, he telephoned police headquarters, asking that a patrol wagon be sent for Hank Holloway, Charlie Phelps, and the other prisoners. "Send a squad to Clyde Blake's home," he said crisply. "I'll meet your men there and provide all the evidence they'll need to make the arrests." Jerry, Salt, and the two reporters were instructed to remain at the tower pending the arrival of the patrol wagon. There was slight danger that any of the prisoners could escape, for all the captives had been locked into the machinery room. Delaying only long enough to obtain the case of sound equipment hidden beneath the daybed, Mr. Parker and Penny hastened to the waiting press car. "Dad!" she marveled as they passed near a street light. "You should see your eye! It's turning black! Someone must have really pasted you hard." "Never mind that now," he returned indifferently. "We're out for a big story, and we're going to get it, too." The police cruiser which had been summoned was not in sight by the time Mr. Parker and Penny reached the Blake home. At first, the house seemed to be dark. However, a dim light glowed from the window of one of the upstairs rear bedrooms. "We'll not wait for the police," Mr. Parker said, starting up the walk. His knock at the door went unanswered. Even when the editor pounded with his fist, no one came to admit him. "Someone is inside," Penny declared, peering up at the lighted window. "It must be Blake." Mr. Parker tried the door and finding it unlocked, stepped boldly into the living room. "Blake!" he shouted. On the floor above, Mr. Parker and Penny heard the soft pad of slippered feet. The real estate man, garbed in a silk black dressing gown, gazed down over the balustrade. "Who is there?" he called. "Anthony Parker from the Star. I want to talk with you." Slowly, Clyde Blake descended the stairway. His gait was stiff and deliberate. "You seem to have injured your leg," Mr. Parker said significantly. "I stumbled on the stairway not 15 minutes ago," Blake answered. "Twisted my ankle. May I ask why I am honored with a visit at this hour?" "You know why I'm here," Mr. Parker retorted, reaching to switch on a living room light. "Indeed, I don't." Deliberately, Blake moved away from the bridge lamp into the shadow, but not before Penny and her father had noted a long, ugly scratch across his cheek. "It's no use to pretend," Mr. Parker said sharply. "I have all the evidence I need to convict you of being a ringleader of the Hoods." "You are quite mad," the real estate man sneered. "Parker, I've put up with you and your methods long enough. You queered my deal with the Orphans' Camp Board. Now you accuse me of being a member of a disreputable organization. You must be out of your mind." "You've always been a good talker, Blake, but this time it will get you nowhere. My reporters were at the Hubell Tower. I have a complete sound record of what transpired there. Either you give yourself up, or the police will take you by force." "So you've notified the police?" "I have." "In that case," Blake's smile was tight. With a dexterousness which caught Penny and her father completely off guard, he whipped a revolver from beneath his dressing gown. "In that case," he completed, "we'll handle it this way. Raise your hands, if you please." "Your politeness quite overpowers me," the editor said sarcastically as he obeyed. "Now turn your back and walk to the telephone," Blake went on. "Call the police station and tell the chief that you made a mistake in asking for my arrest. This will get you nowhere, Blake. Do as I say." Mr. Parker went to the telephone, stalling for time by pretending that he did not know the police station number. "Garfield 4508, Blake supplied. "Say exactly what I tell you, or you'll taste one of my little bullets." The real estate man stood with his back to the darkened dining room in such position that he could cover both Mr. Parker and Penny. As the editor began to dial the phone, he backed a step nearer the archway. Behind him, the dark velvet curtains moved slightly. Penny noted the movement, but gave no indication of it. The next instant, a muscular arm reached through the velvet folds, seizing Blake from the rear. The revolver was torn from his hand. Dropping the telephone, Mr. Parker snatched up the revolver and covered Blake. "All right, it's your turn to reach," he said. As Blake slowly raised his hands, another man stepped into the circle of light. He wore rough garments and had not shaved in many days. "Clem Davis!" Penny exclaimed.
"I came here to get Blake," the man said briefly. "I've thought for a long time he was the person responsible for all my troubles. Tonight, when the clock struck 13, I watched the Hubell Tower. I saw Blake put on his hood and robe and then enter the building. So I knew he was the master."
"You're willing to testify to that?" Mr. Parker asked.
"Yes," Clem Davis nodded. "I've been thinking things over. I'm ready to give myself up and tell what I know."
"You'll have a very difficult time of it proving your absurd charges," Blake said scathingly. "I think not," Mr. Parker corrected. "Ben Bowman was captured tonight, and he's already confessed his part in the real estate swindle. Even if you weren't mixed up with the Hoods, you'll go to jail for that." Blake sagged into a chair, for the first time looking shaken. "I'll make a deal with you, Parker," he began, but the editor cut him short.
"You'll face the music."
"No, Blake, you can't squeeze out of it this time." A car had drawn up in front of the house. Running to the window, Penny saw 3 policemen crossing the street. She hurried to the door to open it for them. "Here's your man," Mr. Parker said as the policeman tramped into the living room. Turning the revolver over to one of the officers, he disclosed exactly what had occurred. Blake was immediately placed under arrest. He was granted 10 minutes to change into street clothing and prepare for his long sojourn in jail. "I'm being persecuted," he whined as he was led away. "This is all a trick to build up circulation for the Star. If there is such an organization as the Black Hoods, Clem Davis is the man who heads it." Penny and Mr. Parker felt very grateful to the fugitive who had come to their aid at such a timely moment. They wished to help him if they could, but they knew he could not escape arrest. Clem Davis realized it too, for he made no protest when told that Sheriff Daniels must be called.
"I'm ready to give myself up," he repeated. "I was a member of the Hoods, but I never went along with them once I learned that they meant to defraud the truck farmers. I hope I can prove my innocence."
Within a few minutes, Sheriff Daniels arrived to assume charge of his prisoner. Entertaining no sympathy for the man, he told Penny and her father that in all likelihood Davis must serve a long sentence.
"He's wanted for setting fire to the Preston barn," the sheriff insisted. "Unless he can prove an alibi for himself, he hasn't a chance."
"Can't you tell where you were at the time of the fire?" Mr. Parker asked the man.
"I was at a place called Tony's."
"Why, that's right, Dad!" Penny cried. "Don't you remember? We saw Davis leave the place and he was followed by 2 men. Probably members of the Hood organization."
"We saw a man leave there shortly after midnight," Mr. Parker agreed. "You wouldn't swear he was Clem Davis?" the sheriff asked. "I'm not sure," Mr. Parker admitted truthfully. "However, it's obvious that a man scarcely could have gone from Tony's at that time and still set fire to the barn. My daughter and I drove directly there, and when we arrived, the building had been burning for some time. All of which proves nothing unless you can show that Clem Davis actually was at Tony's after midnight."
"Could the owner of the place identify you?" Penny thoughtfully inquired.
"I doubt it," Davis answered. "It might be worth a try though."
"Perhaps I can prove that you weren't near the Preston farm at midnight," Penny exclaimed as a sudden idea came to her. "Clem, you heard the Hubell clock strike the hour?"
"Yes, I did."
"How many strokes were there?"
13, Davis answered without hesitation. "I counted them and I figured the Hoods were having one of their get-togethers."
"What is this?" the sheriff demanded in bewilderment.
"We can prove that the Hubell clock did strike 13 on that particular night," Penny resumed. "It was a signal used by the Hoods, but that's not the point."
What are you getting at?
Just this. The Hubble clock can't be heard at the Preston farm.
True.
One can still hear the clock at Tony's, but not a quarter of a mile beyond it. You see, if Mr. Davis heard the 13th stroke, he couldn't have had time to reach the Preston farm and set the fire.
That's an interesting argument, the sheriff said, smiling. And you plead Clem's case very earnestly. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll investigate all these angles you've brought up, and if the evidence supports your theory, I promise he'll go free.
That's fair enough, declared Mr. Parker. The sheriff did not handcuff his prisoner. As they were leaving the house, Clem Davis turned to thank Penny for her interest on his behalf.
Oh, I almost forgot,
he said, taking a rectangular metal object from beneath his baggy coat.
Here's something for you.
A rusty automobile license plate,
Penny exclaimed, staring at it.
Found it in the swamp not far from that abandoned car I told you about.
Then it must have been thrown away by the driver of the hit-run car.
That's how I figure it, Clem Davis drawled. If you can learn the owner of this license plate, you'll know who killed that orphan's folks.
End of chapter 24. Chapter 25, Special Edition. Lights blazed on every floor of the Riverview Star building, proclaiming to all who passed that another special edition was in the process of birth. Pressmen industriously oiled the big rotaries, ready for a big run of papers. Linotype men, compositors, reporters, all were at their posts, having been hastily summoned from comfortable beds. In the editor's office, Penny sat at a typewriter, hammering out copy. Jerking a long sheet of paper from beneath the roller, she offered it to her father. "My contribution to the Hubble clock angle," she said with a flourish. Mr. Parker rapidly scanned the story, making a number of corrections with a blue pencil. "I should slug this editorial material," he remarked with a grin. "Quite a plug you've put in for Seth McGuire," suggesting that he be given back his old job as caretaker of the tower. "Well, don't you think it's a good idea?" "The old man will get his job back. I'll see to that," Mr. Parker promised. "But the front page of the Star is not the place to express wishful thinking. We'll reserve it for news, if you don't mind." Crossing out several lines, Mr. Parker placed the copy in a pneumatic tube and shot it directly to the composing room. He glanced at his watch, noting aloud that in exactly 7 minutes the giant presses would start rolling. "Everything certainly has turned out grand," Penny sighed happily. "Hank Holloway and Clyde Blake are sure to be given long prison sentences for their Black Hood activities. You've promised to see that old Seth gets his job back, so that part will end beautifully. He'll adopt Adele, and I won't need to worry about her anymore." "What makes you think Seth will adopt the orphan?" Mr. Parker asked curiously. "Why, he's wanted to do it from the first. He hesitated because he had no steady work and not enough money. By the way, Dad, how long will it take to learn the owner of that automobile license plate that Clem Davis gave us?" "Jerry's trying to get the information now, Penny. All the registry offices are closed, but if he can pull some official out of bed, there's a chance he may be able to obtain the data tonight. I'm not counting on it, however." The door of the office swung back and City Editor DeWitt hurried into the room. "Everything set?" Mr. Parker inquired.
"We need a picture of Clyde Blake. There's nothing in the morgue."
"Salt Summers has one you might use," Penny cried. "It was taken when Blake came here the other day. He objected to it because it showed that one arm was shorter than the other."
"Just what we need," DeWitt approved. "I'll rush it right out. Except for the picture, front page is all made up."
The door closed behind the city editor, but before Mr. Parker could settle comfortably into his chair, it burst open again. Jerry Livingston, breathless from running up several flights of stairs, faced his chief. "I've got all the dope," he announced. "You learned who drove the hit-run car?" Penny demanded eagerly.
"License was issued in Clyde Blake's name."
"Then Adele's identification at the picnic was correct!"
Penny exclaimed.
"Write your story, Jerry, but make it brief," Mr. Parker said tersely. "We'll make over the front page." Calling DeWitt, he gave the new order. In the composing room, headlines were jerked and a story of minor importance was pulled from the form to make room for the new material. "We'll roll 3 minutes late," Mr. Parker said, glancing at his watch again. "Even so, our papers will make all the trains and we'll scoop every other sheet in town." Jerry wrote his story, which was sent paragraph by paragraph to the composing room. Barely had he typed 3-0, signifying the end, when the lights of the room dimmed for an instant. "There go the presses," Mr. Parker declared, ceasing his restless pacing. Within a few minutes, the first paper, still fresh with ink, was laid upon the editor's desk. Penny peered over his shoulder to read the headlines announcing the arrest of Blake and his followers.
"There's not much here about Ben Bowman," she commented after a moment. "What do you think will happen to him, Dad?"
"That remains to be seen," answered the editor. "He's already wanted for forgery, so it should be fairly easy to prove that he worked with Blake to defraud the camp board."
"I'm worried about the orphans' camp. So much money has been spent clearing the land and setting up equipment."
"Probably everything can be settled satisfactorily in the end," Mr. Parker returned. "It may take time and litigation, but there's no reason why a perfect title can't be obtained to the land."
Penny felt very well pleased at the way everything had turned out. Only one small matter remained unexplained. She had been unable to learn the significance of the watch fob found in Clem Davis' stable.
"Why, I can tell you about that," Jerry Livingston assured her. "The fob belonged to Hank Holloway. He admitted it at the police station. The little boy in the picture is his nephew."
Both Penny and her father were tired, for it was very late. With the Star ready for early morning street sales, they thought longingly of home and bed. Yet, as their car sped down a dimly lighted street, Penny revived sufficiently to say: "How about a steak at Tony's, Dad?"
"Oh, I don't feel like eating at this late hour," Mr. Parker declined.
"That's not the idea, Dad. I'm suggesting a raw steak for that left eye of yours. By morning it will be swollen shut."
"It is quite a shiner," the editor agreed, gazing at his reflection in the car mirror. "But the story was well worth the cost."
"Thanks to whom?" Penny asked mischievously.
"If I say thanks to you, Penny, you will be expecting an increase in your allowance, or something of the sort."
"Maybe I'll ask for it anyhow," Penny chuckled. "And don't forget that you owe me $100 for getting that crackpot Ben Bowman out of your hair."
"So I do," Mr. Parker conceded with a laugh. "That also will be worth the price." End of chapter 25. End of The Clock Strikes 13.